In 1994, scientists flew over Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique and counted the animals below. They found 15 buffalo, not 15,000, not 1,500, 15, where 14,000 had once moved in herds so dense the ground shook. There were 15 animals left on a landscape the size of a small country, 6 lions, 100 hippos, fewer than 200 elephants, most of them so traumatized by what they had survived that researchers are still documenting the effects today. 95% of Gorongosa's large mammals were gone, not reduced, not displaced. Gone. And what happened to the animals was only the first part of the story, because when they disappeared, the land itself began to collapse in ways that took scientists years to understand and decades to begin reversing. This is what it looks like when an entire ecosystem is unmade by war, and what it takes to begin putting it back together. In 1960, Gorongosa was one of the most spectacular wildlife reserves on Earth. 2,200 elephants, 200 lions, 14,000 buffalo, hippos stacked 3 deep in the shallow bends of the Urima River, wildebeest, and zebra moving in columns so long it took an hour for the rear of the herd to pass a fixed point on the road. Scientists who visited in those years used words like overwhelming, staggering, a landscape so full of life it barely seemed real. Then the war came. Mozambique's civil war began in 1977. It did not end until 1992. For 15 years, the park was a battlefield. Soldiers on both sides hunted the animals for meats to feed troops and for ivory to buy weapons. The elephants were targeted first and hardest. Their tusks were worth money. Their bodies could feed 100 men. By the time the guns went quiet, the surveys told a story that was almost impossible to absorb. More than 95% of Gorongosa's large mammals were gone. The 1994 aerial census found 15 buffalo where 14,000 had lived, 6 lions, 100 hippos out of thousands. The elephant population, once 2,200 strong, had collapsed to fewer than 200 individuals. But what the war did to the animals was only the beginning. Because when the animals disappeared, something else began to happen, something that nobody had predicted, and it would take decades to fully understand. Without elephants to knock down trees, push through shrubs, and hold the savanna open, the bush began to close in. Satellite imagery captured it happening in slow motion, year by year. Between 1977 and 2012, tree cover inside Gorongosa increased by 34%. Grassland that had fed vast herds of wildebeest and zebra was swallowed by dense woodland. The open floodplains around Lake Urima, the heart of the park, began to shrink. A Princeton University study published in the Journal of Ecology in 2016 gave a name to what had happened. It found that elephants were the primary architects of the Gorongosa savanna. Their browsing, their weight, their constant movement through the landscape, these were the forces that kept trees in check and grass in light. Remove the elephants, the woodland expands, the grazers disappear, the fire patterns shift, the wetlands degrade. The war had not just killed the animals, it had unmade the landscape they maintained. 12 years after the fighting ended, in 2004, an American philanthropist named Greg Carr sat across from Mozambique's president at Harvard University. By the end of that conversation, they had the outline of a plan. The Gorongosa Restoration Project committed to something that had never been attempted on this scale in Africa. Not just anti-poaching, not just fencing, not just counting animals from helicopters. The full ecological restoration of a park that had been functionally destroyed. The plan made some conservationists nervous. It would restore the wildlife populations, rebuild the vegetation structure they maintained, and simultaneously invest in the 200,000 people living in the buffer zone outside the park. Schools, clinics, agricultural programs. The logic was direct. People who benefit from a healthy park have a reason to protect it. People who are left out have every reason to take from it. What followed was one of the largest wildlife reintroductions ever attempted in Africa. Buffalo returned first, then zebra, then wildebeest. African wild dogs, locally extinct for 25 years, were brought back in 2020. Hyenas followed. Leopards reappeared on camera traps for the first time in decades. And then came the elephants. The helicopters came in low over the bush. Darted animals hit the ground and were loaded carefully, quickly, into transport crates. Across hundreds of kilometers, the trucks moved through the dark. At the release site, the crates opened. The elephants stepped out into a landscape that looked nothing like the one their ancestors had known. Denser, darker, more tree cover than any elephant in Gorongosa had navigated in living memory. And then they got to work. A mature elephant eats up to 300 kilograms of vegetation per day. It pushes over trees. It strips bark. It digs for roots and water in the dry season, creating access points that dozens of other species use for months after. Elephant paths through dense bush become corridors for impala, for warthog, for painted wolves. Elephant dung redistributes seeds across dozens of kilometers, planting the next generation of trees in places no wind or bird could reach. In Gorongosa, the effect was visible within seasons. Where elephants moved through the thickened woodland, light reached the ground again. Grass species that had been shaded out for decades began to regenerate. The floodplains around Lake Urima, choked by encroaching shrubs, began to breathe. But the numbers that came back from the 2018 aerial census stopped the scientists before they published them, because what they counted was not what anyone had dared to expect. More than 100,000 large animals in a park that had held fewer than 10,000 at the lowest point of the war, buffalo above 1,000, hippos at nearly 550, waterbuck now numbering more than 55,000, and the elephant population pushing past 800 individuals. By 2024, the total aerial count reached 110,513 animals, the highest ever recorded in the park's history. The 2025 hydrological surveys added another dimension. Restored wetlands were stabilizing water flow across the dry season. Streams that had run dry during the vegetation-clogged years were holding water later into the season. 229 active marabou stork nests were documented by researchers flying systematic counts across the park. The landscape was responding, but not in the way anyone had planned, and this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Gorongosa's recovery is not a clean success story. Waterbuck dominated the early years because they had survived in higher numbers and reproduced quickly. With apex predators still absent, nothing controlled their population. By 2018, waterbuck accounted for more than 74% of all large herbivore biomass in the park. That is not a healthy ecosystem. That is a system still heavily out of balance, with one species filling space that once held a dozen. Lions came back slowly. Wild dogs required active reintroduction. The black rhino, once native to this landscape, is still absent. Scientists at Princeton, who have tracked Gorongosa's recovery since the early 2000s, have been careful to say exactly this. Biomass has recovered, but community structure has not. The restoration is not finished. And then there is something stranger still, something that reaches beyond population counts and vegetation surveys into the biology of the animals themselves. Gorongosa's elephants are not the same animals that inhabited this park in 1960. The war killed the large-tusked individuals first. They were the most valuable, the most targeted. What survived were the smaller tusked, and in many cases, the tuskless. Normally, roughly 2% of female African elephants are born without tusks. In Gorongosa, a study of females born during and after the war found that proportion had risen above 50%. Natural selection compressed into a single human generation, visibly reshaping the biology of an entire population. Those tuskless elephants are now doing the landscape engineering that tusked elephants do, pushing trees, digging for water, creating corridors through the bush. But without tusks, they do it differently. Less bark stripping, fewer large trees pushed over. The long-term effects on savanna structure are still being measured. The data is still coming in. The war left marks that no restoration plan had accounted for. Marks written into the DNA of the animals that survived it. The war took 15 years to destroy what had taken 10,000 years to assemble. The restoration has taken 20 years, and it is not finished. But here is what the numbers already show. Plainly, in 1994, this park held 15 buffalo and fewer than 200 elephants. In 2024, it held more than 110,000 large animals of dozens of species. Tree cover that had smothered the savanna for 3 decades is retreating where elephant density is highest. Wetlands are stabilizing. Predators are returning. The landscape is responding to the presence of the animals that shaped it, slowly, unevenly, but measurably. What Gorongosa proves is not that ecosystems bounce back in some inevitable, comforting way. It proves that they can be brought back, given enough time, enough resources, enough honesty about how long the work actually takes, and what can never fully be undone. The elephants are back. The land is changing around them. That is not the end of the story. It is the proof that the story can continue.